When I heard that filmmaker Greta Gerwig had a new movie out, I had to see it. She's starred in a few good movies, but I particularly love two that she directed. In 2017, Lady Bird was a semi-autobiographical and had a scene that was set in the Sacramento, California Unitarian Universalist congregation in which she was raised. And my colleague Doug Kraft was shown in the movie playing guitar on Christmas Eve. It was a great little movie. In 2019, she made her own version of Little Women based on the classic novel by 19th century Concord transcendentalist Unitarian Louisa May Alcott. You may have heard of her latest film, this modest little offering called Barbie. It is the highest grossing film by a female director ever. As of Wednesday, it stands at $1.2 billion at the box office. There's only been a half dozen movies that have grossed more than that, ever. And of course, the movie is based on the fictional life and times of Barbara Millicent Roberts, the doll created in the 1950s by Ruth Handler. Mrs. Handler recognized that up to that point, the only dolls that existed were baby dolls, and that they were designed to do one thing, to train little girls to be mothers, and only mothers. And Ruth Handler wanted more for her daughter, so she partnered with her husband's company, a little concern called Mattel, and she created an empire. They named the doll Barbie because they wanted her to have universal girl appeal, and Barbara was one of the most popular girls' names of the baby boomer generation. Over the last 64 years, dozens, if not hundreds, of different Barbies have been released. She embraced different style trends, different looks, different pastimes. Her house has been radically transformed with each decade that passes. And she's had every job you can imagine. Flight attendant, nurse, Olympic skier, veterinarian, astronaut. About the only job she hasn't done is minister. But I'm not offended. And of course, for decades, she had a weird, unnatural body and those feet that were in the permanent high heel pose. And she was way too white for way too long. But she always taught girls an important lesson. You can be anything that you want to be. And this mix of nostalgia and politics can be box office gold, especially in the days of the spectacular, super colorful, high budget franchise films, and in these times of social polarization. The Barbie movie has been mostly marketed as a comedy, one that will be enjoyed by people who love Barbie and people who hate Barbie equally. And clearly it's had that appeal, but it's probably not as funny as anyone expected, especially not kids. Though I have to say, when Joe and I saw it, we were charmed by the gaggle of 10-year-old girls behind us who giggled and laughed through the whole thing, even through the parts that were decidedly unfunny, which was most of the time. It's a stupid plot. Barbie lives in a hot pink world where all the other Barbies, with all these other Barbies, where they magically move through their houses that are multi-stories but don't have stairs, and they just sort of fly around, and they pretend to eat plastic food that doesn't really exist, and they drive cars that are way too small for them with their heads sticking out of the top. They wake up in the morning and they wave to each other from bed because their houses have no walls. And they go off to their jobs running the world as judges and politicians and scientists, and their days end with what else? Dance parties. And Barbie Land is fabulous. It's a fun world in which women hold all the power, do all the important work, and support each other cheerfully and unquestioningly. Conflicts are minor and easily resolved. Mutual respect and appreciation abound. It's magic. It's pink magic. And our hero, Barbie, the star, the main character, played by Margot Robbie, has an existential crisis and has to go out into the real world to figure out what's going on. And Ken follows her. And Ken discovers patriarchy. Now, I loved it, mainly because of the UU influence. As somebody with a fair amount of familiarity with our whole lives curriculum about sexuality, gender, relationships, and intimacy, I could see the Unitarian Universalism in Greta Gerwig, the director and co-writer. It's a UU film. Even if Gerwig doesn't identify as one of us anymore, it is a UU film, and you can feel the Unitarian Universalism in her. Her deft handling of the subject, which is way more complex and nuanced than you'd think if you haven't seen it, got me thinking about expectations around gender, fitting in, commercialism, consumerism, patriarchy, and feminism, and even how we operate here in this congregation. It's funny, though, that it's pissing off a lot of conservative clergy. Last summer, this one guy, I think his name's Craig Locke, wrapped a Louisville Slugger in Bible passages, and from the chancel of his congregation, smashed a Barbie dream house into oblivion. Right? Because that's really effective. You know, this is why people hate ministers, I gotta say. So with a different kind of perspective, I'd like to share my own observations about the movie. First, the main character, Barbie, the one played by Margot Robbie, refers to herself as stereotypical Barbie to differentiate herself from all of the other equally great Barbies. She wasn't called original Barbie or regular Barbie or normal Barbie. She was stereotypical. In other words, expected, common, cliche, even banal. In the common parlance of Gen Z, stereotypical is basic. Nobody wants to be stereotypical. Now, what would the world be like if, when we fall into a lot of majority categories like white, heterosexual, middle class, tall, thin, able-bodied, cisgender, we thought of ourselves as stereotypical and not normal or regular? What if we thought of ourselves as cliches and welcomed the variety of the people around us, and without putting ourselves down, learn new ways of being, or even just recognize that being in the majority isn't all that great all the time? Maybe it's even kind of boring. But the thing I found really funny was that even in that world, even in Barbie Land, where the main character is stereotypical, she was still the main character. How true to the real world is that? Other Barbies had different skin tones, hair types, and body types. One even used a wheelchair. And stereotypical Barbie was still the main character. In the ending credits, there were 16 Barbies and 6 Kens, but only one Skipper, her little sister, and only one Midge, her pregnant friend. Personally, I wish there had been dozens, hundreds of midges just to piss off the anti-abortion fascists. Of course, there was only one Alan, the nondescript friend of Ken, whose only role is to be a companion. So Alan is basically a sidekick to a sidekick, only one of him. I guess the lesson here is that even when you are aware of the power that comes with being a popular majority, and you want to comment on the problems that creates, you still end up being the center of attention. And when you're an outsider, you're always an outsider. Even if you become cool for being an outsider, you're still an outsider. It's a reminder that we each see the world through our own lenses, and those lenses are impossible to change, largely because we are the center of our own universes. You know, I couldn't help but see the whole film through the perspective of Alan a little bit, but mostly through Ken, because there were more Kens than Allens. Now, I am nowhere near as young, tall, muscular, or good looking or rich as Ken. But alas, I can relate to Ken, all the Kens in the movie. I read somewhere that when Greta Gerwig asked Ryan Gosling to take the role, he needed a little time to think about it. He went home and he saw his daughter playing with her Barbie dolls in the backyard, and he saw Ken face down in the mud. So he took a picture and he texted it to Greta Gerwig saying, "Alas, the story of Ken must be told. I shall take the role." At some point in the film, as Barbie is working through her existential crisis, Ken is having his own existential crisis. You know, he discovered patriarchy, but he still doesn't know who he is without Barbie. He says it's Barbie and Ken. Without Barbie, there's no Ken. And when asked by real world Gloria where Ken lives in Barbie land, stereotypical Barbie stops and she thinks a moment and says nonchalantly, "Gee, I don't know." Ken, she later says, is superfluous. So it comes as no surprise that when Ken experiences the real world, that he would discover patriarchy. He gets drunk on bro power. And when the film ended, after we listened to the cishet guy next to us mansplain the entire movie to his girlfriend, you know, right? He mansplained Barbie to his girlfriend. So Joe and I talked a lot about the main characters after that. And the next day, after some thought, dear Joe, my dear husband, posted this to his social media. "This is my Barbie hot take. Any unexamined hegemony, regardless of who it benefits, is dangerous to those who are outside the power structure. Absolute power owes a redress to those it has discounted and banned, even if he has clumsily tried to balance power by overreacting. Ken has never had any power before. Of course, Ken is going to make mistakes. Of course, Ken is going to find power intoxicating. Of course, Ken is going to make mistakes. Of course, Ken is going to misuse power in all the ways every oppressed minority ever has oppressed power when they gain it. Minorities rarely have real power, and they virtually never have equal power." Honestly, as I watched all the Kens and the one Alan move around Barbie Land, I thought about this place. I thought about the UU congregation of South County in little old Peacedale, Rhode Island, and I could really relate to those guys. Out in the real world, I have the power of a male-bodied white person. But I'm queer, and I'm a little old man, so I'm kind of invisible. I'm more of a beta male, like Alan, the sidekick to the bigger men with bigger trucks. But here, especially in this fabulous suit, I kind of feel I can sometimes. I can be a bit of a star on Sunday, I'll admit, but during the rest of the week, I'm definitely not the guy with all the power in a system that I jokingly call the sisterhood of getting it done. My job in this mostly female space is to show up, listen, and carry out the wishes of the leadership. And when we do any kind of social justice work together, again, My job is to show up, shut up, and do what I'm told. I'm okay with that. I let the women and the people of color speak and to make the decisions and to assign the roles. And please don't think I'm complaining. Because like Barbie Land, this is a magical place. It's not all pink fashion and dance parties, but it's kind of the UU version of that. A come as you are block party with sensible shoes and food that everyone can eat. It's mostly women who show up, do the hard work, and make the decisions and handle the money and correct me whenever I make a mistake. I sometimes wonder what men think when they arrive here for the first time. And maybe if you're a guy and you're kind of new to the system, you can tell me what you think. Now, surely other congregations and other denominations are made up primarily of women, but in most traditions, women don't really have any power, even when they're a super majority, especially in traditions where men have always been named the prophets and not women. As a little aside, no other faith tradition in this country has so many women in leadership as Unitarian Universalism. Nearly all of the major positions in our denomination are filled by women, and the rest are filled by queer and or trans men. And a super majority of our ministers, more than 2/3, are women. And I think it's great, and I'm proud to be part of a national association that's so dedicated to reversing the effects of centuries of one form of hegemony. Even if that means that in this system, I have less power than I otherwise would. I'm perfectly okay with being a beta. But back to the men who come here for the first time. I always wonder, do they notice that there's no men's room in the building? You do. So we have multi-purpose restrooms, multi-person restrooms for women and for children, but only one single person restroom that's to be used for everybody who uses a wheelchair or appliance or people that are too fabulous for one gender and men. So that's a lot of people sharing one cubicle. So if anyone who could use any other room chooses to use that room, then wait. So I don't know if you've noticed, but before service, there's usually a line of tenor and basses to get into that one cubicle. Sometimes that is even why we start late. Now, I know women's restrooms are never adequate in public spaces compared to men's rooms. I totally get that. I see the line. I know which one I go into. But this is one of those ways in which perhaps we've overcorrected an old hegemony, maybe a little clumsily. It's not that big a deal. God knows solving that little problem should be really, really, really low on our list of priorities, but it's there. And men notice, and everyone should notice. And the thing about the sisterhood of getting it done is that it functions exactly the way women function in groups of women. No, seriously, I've worked in places where I've been the only man, and I've worked in places where there are 0 women. And there's a big difference in how the two function. You could say it's the difference between competition and cooperation, but I think it's more nuanced than that, and probably a topic for another day. Suffice it to say that for a lot of guys, it can be tough to figure out how this system works. So it can be kind of easy to fall into that old default mode that is best described by the unfortunate and perhaps unintentionally misogynistic phrase, happy wife, happy life. I know that phrase absolutely makes me cringe. It makes me cringe every single time I hear it. And it's rare that I hear it here. But sometimes, now let's be clear, I never hear guys complaining about this system, ever, not once. There won't be an uprising of dudes decrying their perceived forced feminization. Unitarian Universalism in general, and this congregation specifically, have been for decades an antidote to the testosterone-driven victimhood of the army of bros toting nearly all of the 440 million guns in this country. There's one final similarity between Barbie World and UU South County. There's a big focus on being busy, making timely decisions and getting things done efficiently, but really being busy. Betsy's laughing because she knows. Sometimes I worry that in the sisterhood of getting it done, we might leave our visitors feeling like the guest monk in the story that I told earlier. That maybe, just maybe, there might be a language everyone is using that's kind of a mystery to outsiders, especially men. A language that's a kind of shortcut that leaves people out. And when they attempt to fit in by plugging into the system, newcomers might be met with blank stares. Or they might share something so delightful that it enchants us and changes everything we do, like the third guest in the monastery who got uproarious laughter. The thing about that version of the story is that the visitor didn't really know what he was talking about. All he did was shout out a random number, 98. The resident brothers greeted him with incredible generosity. There was no joke there. They just decided to accept him as if he were the most enchanting person in the room. And my hope is that here we can meet everyone where they are, as they are, with the gifts they have to offer right here and now, without being too attached to doing things the way that we've always done them. I love that this is the sisterhood of getting it done for a zillion reasons, not the least of which is the creative energy in this system. But I also hope that maybe we can find a way to become more of a siblinghood of just being, an organization that is even more inclusive of all genders, an organization that takes the time more often to just be together without a task list, a place with more meditation and prayer, more listening and silence, more putting aside the to-do list, and more welcoming everyone as if they're the most enchanting people we've ever met. Maybe Midge and Alan might show up and find a place here. Wouldn't that be cool? Maybe so. Let's rise now and remain standing through the end of the service as we open our hymnals to number 118 to sing